Decades after civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marched for voting rights, his children will continue his acts of service and honor him this holiday weekend. The King family is leading a voting rights march in D.C. as Democrats push to change Senate filibuster rules to enact new laws addressing elections. Dr. King's daughter, Dr. Bernice King, says voting rights should be a bipartisan goal.
When my father and them faced these kind of situations, they used the twin approaches of direct action and negotiation. And we have to continue in that vein. I mean, when we talk about that moral arc being bent towards justice, we have to be that force. And so you never know when the heart changes. And so if we just buy into the notion they don't support it, let's be done with the Republicans, we won't get there.
Joining us now is Andrea Hailey, CEO of Vote.org, to help put the recent voting discussions into context. Andrea, let's start with data from Vote.org. It says 24 million voters of color will be impacted by new restrictive voting laws passed in 19 states. Can you explain how and why that is exactly?
Absolutely. On the heels of historic turnout in our nation that we saw in 2020, there were several hundreds actually of voter suppression bills that crisscrossed this nation. Those bills disproportionately affect voters of color, young voters, voters with disabilities. They also affect everyone holistically, though. And so what Vote.org is saying is that without federal protections, without senators doing their job and passing voting rights legislation at the federal level, those state bills, we won't really have any recourse against them, which means that upwards, we think it's a conservative estimate of upwards of 24 million voters could be separated from their ability to vote in the United States in the upcoming midterm elections. The legislation that is on the Capitol Hill right now could remedy this situation, and we really hope that senators do what they need to do and vote to pass voting rights.
Yeah, and let's get a little specific here, if we can, for people who, don't read through legislative bills in their free time, okay? Which restrictions would you say are the most egregious or worry you the most, state-wise?
Well, some of the things that we saw in the last, election cycle could get much worse. We could have increased closing of polling locations, specifically in neighborhoods where lots of voters of color live. We already have seen these long lines across the nation, 7-8 hour lines. I myself, as a voter in Indiana, stood in a 7-hour line trying to cast my ballot. I think that this is, something very real. What used to happen was that states that have a history of voter suppression had to alert federal authorities before doing things like moving polling locations all around or closing them down. Without the protections in the Voting Rights Act, and without those protections being restored in our nation, they're no longer required to have that federal oversight.
So can you explain the importance of organizations like yours empowering young voters to address this, right? Because obviously Congress doesn't always reflect the younger voting bloc. So what can young voters do in this fight for their own voting rights and working with organizations like yours?
Yes, we saw, again, with the historic numbers of turnout in the last election cycle, young voters were a large part of that story. Young voters showed up in record numbers, and we recently conducted a poll at Vote.org and found that over 70% of the young voters who showed up in the 2020 election cycle plan to show up in the midterm elections. That's huge, and it's huge progress in our nation. Young voters know exactly what's happening. They care about the right to vote. They care about their fellow citizens' right to vote. They're not really interested in voter suppression or the fights of people who were 2 generations, 3 generations removed from them. They're really motivated to protect the freedom to vote right now and protect their values and our democracy. So it's important to keep that they stay energized, stay excited, and that they join organizations like Vote.org and several other great voting rights organizations that are out there, because they're going to be our future on the front lines of this fight.
Andrea Hailey, thank you so much for coming here and having a conversation with us that I would think some of the ancestors who were alive with Dr. King would not be so happy that a new Dr. King is having to do the same things and have the same conversations, but we'll see what happens. Andrea, thank you so much.
You know, my favorite quotation is Coretta Scott King's quotation. She said the struggle is real and freedom is never really won. It has to be won by each generation. And I think that's the moment we find ourselves in now. So I have a lot of faith in all the American public, though, to get out there to vote and to participate and protect our freedom.
Absolutely. Andrea, thank you so much for your time and expertise. Guys, we'll be right back.
Thank you.
For people